What if the world you think of as primitive was, in many ways, more intimate with the human body than we have ever allowed ourselves to be? What if the people we call medieval, the ones we imagine huddled in darkness and ignorance, had developed an entire philosophy of living that was simply different from ours, not lesser, not lost, but operating on assumptions so foreign to modern sensibility that encountering them now produces something between laughter and a quiet, unsettling recognition. Tonight, we open the files on medieval Europe, not the sanitized version with noble knights and illuminated manuscripts arranged tastefully behind museum glass. The real archive, the one that includes the urine mouthwash, the communal sleeping arrangements, the physicians who diagnosed illness by tasting your blood, and the deeply sincere belief that bathing too frequently might let the plague in through your pores. We are going to walk through a world that was, by every measurable standard, completely normal to the people living in it, and we are going to let that strangeness wash over us slowly, the way cold water moves over stone. Not shocking, not alarming, but persistent, patient, and quietly revelatory. Before we go further, if you enjoy stories where history refuses to make comfortable sense, where the past turns out to be stranger and more human than the textbooks suggested, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you are listening in the dark somewhere, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I want to imagine this silence stretching across the world, all of us gathered here in the small hours, opening the same archive together. Now dim the lights, let your shoulders settle, and let us ease into the night. There is something worth establishing before we begin pulling individual threads from the medieval tapestry. The period we call the Middle Ages spans roughly 1,000 years, from the slow dissolution of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century through to the emergence of the Renaissance in the 15th. 1,000 years is not a single moment. It is not a single culture. It is not a single set of habits or beliefs or hygiene practices. Medieval Europe was as varied across time and geography as any other civilization, perhaps more so because it lacked the centralizing force that Rome had once provided. What was normal in a 10th century Anglo-Saxon village might have been considered strange in a 13th century Parisian household. What a Venetian merchant considered ordinary daily practice might have bewildered a Scottish farmer entirely. Consider what it means to hold 1,000 years in your mind at once. The distance between the fall of Rome and the first stirrings of the Renaissance is roughly the same as the distance between us and the Norman conquest. It is the distance between a world in which the memory of Roman roads and Roman law was still fresh, still present in the landscape in the form of actual stone, and a world in which that memory had been so thoroughly absorbed and transformed that it was no longer recognizable as memory at all. It had become simply the way things were. The past had become the present, and the present had become, gradually, something new. And yet, certain patterns do emerge, certain habits and customs and assumptions about the body, about cleanliness, about privacy, about medicine, about food and sleep, and the relationship between the living and the dead. These threads run through the medieval period with enough consistency that we can hold them up and examine them. And when we do, they look, from our modern vantage point, profoundly, almost comically wrong. And yet, from inside the logic of the time, they made complete sense. That is the thing about normal. It is never absolute. It is always constructed, always inherited, always dependent on the assumptions your particular moment in history has handed you without asking whether you wanted them. The medieval person received their assumptions the same way you received yours, through the air they breathed, through the words spoken to them in childhood, through the practices of the community that shaped them before they were old enough to question anything. They did not choose their framework any more than you chose yours. They simply lived inside it, as you live inside yours. And from within that framework, everything made sense. The medieval person did not think of themselves as primitive. They thought of themselves as living correctly, following the wisdom of physicians, theologians, philosophers, and ancestors who had accumulated knowledge over centuries. They had systems, they had reasons, and some of those reasons, when you trace them back to their source, turn out to be surprisingly coherent, even if the practices themselves make modern stomachs turn. So let us begin with the body, because the medieval relationship with the human body was, above all else, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Consider the bedroom, not the medieval bedroom as a private sanctuary, which is largely a modern invention, but the medieval bedroom as a communal space, a shared warmth, a practical solution to the problem of surviving winter in a stone building with no central heating and precious little insulation. In the medieval household, sleeping alone was not the norm. It was not even particularly desirable. Beds were expensive, warmth was essential, and the idea that a person might want to sleep in isolation away from family members or guests or servants would have struck most medieval people as either eccentric or wasteful, possibly both. Imagine, for a moment, what the night actually looked like in a medieval village in northern England in the depths of January. The sun has been down for hours. There is no electric light, no gas lamp, no reliable candle for everyone in the household. The fire in the central hearth has been banked low to preserve fuel. The temperature inside the building is not dramatically different from the temperature outside. The wind moves through gaps in the walls, through imperfectly fitted shutters, through the spaces between the thatch overhead. In this environment, warmth is not a comfort. It is a survival strategy. And the warmest thing available to a human being in that situation is another human being. In peasant households, the entire family might share a single sleeping space, often with the animals quartered nearby, or even inside the same structure, because the body heat of livestock was a genuine and significant source of warmth during northern European winters. This was not considered degrading, it was considered practical. The smell of animals was simply the smell of winter survival, and no one was particularly troubled by it. The cow in the corner of the room was not a sign of poverty in the shameful sense. It was a sign of resourcefulness, of the practical intelligence that understood warmth as a resource to be gathered from wherever it could be found. But even in wealthier households, the idea of the private bedroom as we understand it today did not really exist. Servants slept in the same room as their masters, sometimes on pallets at the foot of the bed, sometimes simply on the floor. Guests were routinely invited to share a bed with their hosts, not as an intimate gesture, but as a hospitable one. Inns and taverns along medieval roads would think nothing of placing multiple strangers in the same bed together. You paid for a bed, not necessarily for exclusive use of it. If the inn was full, you might find yourself pressed against 2 or 3 other travellers you had never met, all of you wrapped in the same blanket, all of you accepting this as simply the way things were. There is a term historians use for this practice: bundling. Though that word carries its own specific connotations in certain cultural contexts, the broader phenomenon is simply that medieval sleep was a collective experience in a way that modern sleep almost never is. The night was dark, cold, and full of genuine dangers, from fire to illness to the practical threat of thieves or violence. There was safety in proximity, there was warmth in closeness, and there was nothing shameful about the body needing other bodies nearby to rest comfortably. What strikes the modern observer is not just the physical closeness, but the complete absence of the anxiety we would feel in the same situation. We have been trained over centuries of gradually increasing privatization of domestic space to experience our sleeping bodies as deeply personal, as requiring separation from others in order to be safe. The medieval person had not received that training. Their body was not a private territory in the same way. It was a social instrument, a communal resource, a thing that existed in relationship to other bodies in ways we have largely forgotten. There is something else worth noting about medieval sleep that is genuinely strange to modern ears. Several historians, most notably A. Roger Ekirk, in his careful study of pre-industrial sleep patterns, have argued that medieval and early modern people did not sleep in the single long block that modern people consider normal. Instead, they slept in 2 distinct phases, separated by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night that lasted anywhere from an hour to several hours. This period between the first sleep and the second sleep was not insomnia. It was not a problem to be solved. It was a recognized and expected part of the night, a time for quiet activity, for prayer, for conversation with a bedfellow, for reading by firelight if you were literate and had a candle, for simply lying in the darkness and thinking. Medieval and early modern texts reference this pattern with a casualness that suggests it was entirely unremarkable. People wrote about their first sleep and their second sleep as naturally as we write about breakfast and dinner. The night had a shape, and that shape included a waking interval at its centre. And in that interval, the medieval person was not anxious. They were simply awake, in the dark, in the warmth of their shared bed, in the company of their household, with the night spread out around them like a familiar room. This is the first thread we pull from the medieval archive. The body was not private, not in the way we mean, not in the way that feels to us like the only possible way to mean it. If this kind of quiet excavation of the past is the sort of thing that keeps you up at night, it would mean a great deal to have you like this video and subscribe to the channel so the archive stays open for you. Now let us talk about cleanliness, because there is a persistent myth about medieval hygiene that deserves to be both acknowledged and complicated. The myth goes something like this. Medieval people never bathed. They smelled terrible. They were coated in filth from birth to death, and the entire period was essentially one long exercise in festering. This is, to put it plainly, not accurate. But the truth that replaces it is, in its own way, even stranger. Medieval people did bathe. There is substantial documentary evidence for this. Public bathhouses, called stews in England, and bagnios, or stufa, in various continental traditions, were common features of medieval urban life. In 13th and 14th century Paris, there were more than 24 public bathhouses operating in the city. Medieval literature references bathing as a routine activity. Manuscripts show illustrations of people in wooden tubs. Aristocratic households maintained bathing facilities, and the ritual bath was a significant part of ceremonies like knighthood. You did not become a knight without first bathing. The bath was a purification, a preparation, a symbolic cleansing before the sacred transformation. The bathhouse was also, it is worth noting, a social institution in a way that goes beyond simple hygiene. In medieval cities, the public bathhouse was a place where people of different social stations could encounter one another in a context stripped of some of the usual markers of rank. You are, after all, much harder to read when you are not wearing your clothes. The bathhouse was a place of conversation, of news exchange, of the particular intimacy that comes from shared physical vulnerability. It was, in some cities, a place where food and drink were served, where musicians played, where the boundaries between bathing establishment and tavern and something more ambiguous became pleasantly blurred. The church disapproved of this ambiguity with some regularity. The bathhouses continued regardless, so the idea that medieval people simply never bathed is wrong. What is true is that their relationship with bathing was governed by a completely different set of assumptions about what bathing was for and what it did to the body. Medieval medicine operated primarily within the framework of humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, and transmitted through Arabic scholarship into European universities. According to this framework, the body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and health was a matter of keeping these humours in proper balance. The skin was understood as a kind of permeable membrane, a boundary that was not entirely fixed, through which substances could enter and leave the body. This belief had a profound effect on attitudes toward bathing. Hot water, it was widely believed, opened the pores of the skin. An open pores meant that whatever was in the air, whatever miasma or corrupt vapor or pestilential influence was circulating in the environment could enter the body more easily. Bathing, particularly in hot water, was therefore considered potentially dangerous, not because it made you dirty, but because it made you vulnerable. You were, in a sense, unlocking the door of your body to whatever was waiting outside. Think about that for a moment. The medieval physician who advised against frequent bathing was not being careless with their patient's health. They were being careful with it by the best theoretical standards available to them. They were applying a coherent model of how the body worked, how it interacted with its environment, how disease entered and took hold. The model was wrong, but the reasoning from the model was sound. And this is, as we will find again and again in the medieval archive, the pattern that keeps recurring. Wrong premises, applied with genuine rigour, producing conclusions that look like madness from the outside, but feel like medicine from within. This belief intensified dramatically during plague years, when the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, killing somewhere between a third and half of the continent's population. The advice of physicians and authorities was, in many cases, to avoid bathing, not because they were ignorant of cleanliness, but because they were applying the best medical theory available to them. which said that open pores invited infection. In a world where the actual mechanism of plague transmission was completely unknown. This was a reasonable application of existing knowledge to a terrifying situation. It was wrong, but it was not stupid. It was the best available answer to an impossible question. The result, over time, was a gradual shift in attitudes toward bathing, particularly in the aftermath of repeated plague epidemics. By the later medieval period, frequent bathing had become associated in some circles not with cleanliness, but with danger. And the alternative that emerged in its place was a different theory of hygiene entirely. One centered not on washing the skin, but on changing the linen next to it. This is one of the most genuinely strange things about medieval and early modern European hygiene, and it takes a moment to fully absorb. For a significant portion of the medieval and post-medieval period, cleanliness was understood primarily as a property of linen. White linen, the undershirt worn against the skin, was believed to absorb and draw away the impurities of the body. Changing your linen regularly was, in this framework, the equivalent of washing. The clean linen cleaned you. The act of putting on fresh white cloth was a hygienic act in the same way that showering is a hygienic act for us. This is why wealthy medieval and Renaissance households placed such extraordinary emphasis on the quality, quantity, and whiteness of their linen. A nobleman with dozens of fine white shirts was not being vain. He was being hygienic by the standards of his time. He was demonstrating that he had access to the means of true cleanliness, which was not water but cloth. The laundress who maintained that linen, who kept it white and clean and pressed, was performing a genuinely vital function in the household's health. And here is where it becomes truly strange, because this system was not entirely irrational. Linen does absorb moisture and oils from the skin. Changing it regularly does remove those substances from the body's immediate environment. In a world without germ theory, without any understanding of bacteria or viral transmission, the linen theory of hygiene was a coherent and not entirely ineffective response to the problem of bodily cleanliness. It was wrong about the mechanism, but it was not entirely wrong about the outcome. What it produced, however, was a world in which the smell of the human body was a constant and accepted feature of daily life in a way that is almost impossible for modern people to fully imagine. Not because medieval people were indifferent to smell, they were not. Medieval literature is full of references to pleasant and unpleasant odors and aromatic substances like rose water and herbs were widely used to perfume clothing and rooms and bodies. But the baseline olfactory environment of medieval life was simply different from ours, richer, more present, more human, and entirely normal to the people living within it. Now let us talk about the urine, because we cannot visit the medieval archive without spending some time with the remarkable range of applications that medieval people found for human urine, and the entirely reasonable logic that governed those applications. We mentioned it at the outset, the practice of using urine as a mouthwash. This is not a myth, it is documented, and the reason for it connects directly to the same chemical principle that the Romans had already discovered centuries earlier. Urine contains ammonia. Ammonia is a powerful cleaning and whitening agent. The Romans used collected urine to clean their laundry. Medieval people, working within a similar practical understanding of urine's properties used it for dental hygiene. Specifically, the ammonia in urine was understood to whiten teeth and kill the kind of oral decay that led to pain and tooth loss. There is evidence from Roman medical writers whose texts remained in circulation throughout the medieval period, recommending urine as a dental rinse. Medieval physicians and herbalists drew on this tradition, and in a world without modern toothpaste, without fluoride treatments, without the entire industrial apparatus of oral hygiene that we take for granted, urine was a genuinely available and chemically functional alternative. It worked, in the limited sense that ammonia does have some antibacterial properties and does have whitening effects on enamel. It was not pleasant, but pleasant was not always the primary criterion. Urine appeared in medieval medicine in a remarkable variety of other contexts as well. It was used to clean wounds, again with some chemical justification, since the ammonia content does have mild antiseptic properties. It was used in the tanning of leather. It was used in the dyeing of cloth, where its ammonia content helped fix certain pigments. It was used in some agricultural contexts as a fertilizer, and perhaps most fascinatingly, it was used as a diagnostic tool. Uroscopy, the practice of examining urine to diagnose illness, was one of the most important and respected medical techniques of the medieval period. The physician who could read urine, who could assess its color, its clarity, its smell, its consistency, its foam, the way it settled in the glass flask, was considered a skilled practitioner of a sophisticated art. Medieval medical manuscripts devoted extensive sections to uroscopy. There were elaborate color charts showing what different shades of urine indicated about the state of the patient's humors and the nature of their illness. The uroscopy flask, a round glass vessel specifically designed for examining urine, became one of the defining symbols of the medieval physician. When medieval artists painted or carved images of doctors, they often depicted them holding this flask up to the light. It was the stethoscope of its age, the primary diagnostic instrument, and while modern medicine would not endorse most of what medieval physicians read into urine samples, it is worth noting that urine analysis remains a legitimate and useful diagnostic tool today. The medieval physician was not wrong to look at urine for information about health. They were wrong about what that information meant and how to interpret it, but the fundamental instinct was sound. Some physicians went further than examination. There are documented cases of medieval and early modern physicians tasting their patients' urine as part of the diagnostic process. The taste of urine, its sweetness or bitterness or saltiness, was believed to carry additional information about the state of the body. What we now know as diabetes mellitus, the condition in which blood sugar is elevated, was historically identified partly through the sweet taste of the patient's urine. The medieval physician who tasted urine was, in this specific instance, performing a diagnostic act that modern medicine has since confirmed as meaningful. The mechanism they used to explain what they were detecting was completely wrong, but the detection itself was real. This is the pattern that keeps emerging as we move through the medieval archive. Practices that look, from the outside, like pure ignorance or barbarism, turn out, on closer examination, to contain a kernel of functional understanding wrapped in an explanatory framework that time has since dismantled. The medieval world was not operating without reason. It was operating with different reasons, and some of those reasons, stripped of their incorrect theoretical clothing, point toward truths that took us centuries longer to fully articulate. I want to pause here and ask you something. What other ancient or medieval practices have you come across that turned out to be stranger and more logical than they first appeared? Drop it in the comments. The archive grows richer every time someone adds a thread. Let us move now to the question of food, because the medieval table is another place where the familiar and the deeply strange exist in very close proximity. The basic structure of medieval European diet was determined primarily by social class, geography, and the liturgical calendar. For the majority of the population, the peasantry, who made up perhaps 80 or 90% of medieval Europe's people, the diet was simple, heavily dependent on grain, supplemented by vegetables, legumes, and occasional dairy or meat. Bread was the foundation of everything, dark, dense, often made from rye or tis, barley, or mixed grains rather than the refined wheat that the wealthy preferred. Pottage, a thick stew of whatever was available, vegetables, grains, herbs. Occasionally a small amount of meat was the standard meal for most people most of the time. The pottage pot was, in many peasant households, essentially never empty. New ingredients were added as old ones were consumed. The pot sat over the fire day after day, accumulating layers of flavour and history, a kind of culinary palimpsest in which the taste of last week's turnips mingled with this week's onions and whatever dried herbs had been preserved from the summer harvest. This was not considered monotonous by the people eating it. It was considered sustaining. It was the reliable foundation of daily life, the thing that kept the body working through the cold months and the hungry months, and the months when the harvest had been poor and the margin between adequacy and starvation was uncomfortably thin. For the wealthy, the situation was dramatically different, and here is where things become genuinely interesting. Medieval aristocratic cuisine was governed by a philosophy of food that was simultaneously sophisticated and, by modern nutritional standards, quite bizarre. The humoral theory that governed medicine also governed food. Different foods were classified according to their humoral properties. Some were hot and moist, some cold and dry, some hot and dry, some cold and moist. A properly balanced meal was one that combined foods in ways that maintained or corrected the diner's humoral balance. Your physician might prescribe specific foods for your particular constitution, just as they might prescribe herbs or other treatments. This meant that the medieval aristocratic cook was operating as a kind of medical practitioner, carefully composing menus that were therapeutically as well as gastronomically considered. The spices that flavored wealthy medieval food were not merely decorative, they were medicinally significant. Cinnamon, ginger, pepper, cloves, nutmeg. These were understood to have specific humoral properties that could warm a cold constitution or dry a moist one. The elaborate spiced sauces of medieval haute cuisine were not just showing off, though they were certainly doing that too. They were also making medical claims. The extraordinary value placed on spices in medieval Europe, the fact that pepper and cinnamon and nutmeg were worth their weight in silver, was not merely a matter of taste. It was a matter of health philosophy. Spices were medicine. The spice trade that connected medieval Europe to the markets of Asia was, in part a pharmaceutical trade, and the wealthy person who could afford to spice their food heavily was not just displaying status. They were, by their own understanding, investing in their health. The cook who could work with these ingredients skillfully was not merely a craftsperson. They were something closer to a healer, a person whose knowledge of the properties of substances and their combinations was as significant as any physician's. Now, some of the specific foods that appeared on wealthy medieval tables would strike modern diners as extraordinary. Peacock was a prestige dish, not particularly because it tasted good, it apparently did not, but because of its visual impact when served. Medieval feasts were theatrical events, and food was as much a visual spectacle as a culinary one. A peacock might be roasted and then redressed in its own feathers before being brought to the table, so that it appeared to be alive and magnificent. The flavour was secondary to the statement. Porpoise appeared at medieval feasts because it was classified, along with other marine mammals, as a fish for the purposes of the liturgical calendar. Medieval Christianity required abstinence from meat on Fridays and during Lent, a significant portion of the year. Fish was permitted, and since porpoise lived in the water, medieval food theology classified it as fish. So on fast days, wealthy households might serve what was technically a mammal with a complex social structure and significant cognitive capacity, and consider themselves in full compliance with the requirements of religious abstinence. The logic was consistent. The outcome would make a modern marine biologist wince. But within the framework of medieval biological classification, it made complete sense. Swans were another prestige food. In England, all unmarked swans on open water were the property of the Crown, a legal tradition that technically persists to this day in modified form. To serve swan at your feast was to be the kind of person who had access to royal prerogatives, either through ownership rights or through gifts from the monarch. The taste of swan was, by most accounts, not particularly remarkable. The point was not the taste. The point was the statement. And then there was the question of sugar. In the medieval period, sugar was an expensive luxury imported from the Mediterranean and beyond. It was not primarily a confection. It was a spice, a medicine, a preservative, and a sculptural medium. Wealthy medieval tables featured elaborate sugar sculptures called subtleties, three-dimensional tableaux made from sugar paste depicting castles, animals, heraldic devices, religious scenes. These were not meant to be eaten immediately. They were meant to be admired. They were the centerpiece of the feast, a demonstration of the host's wealth and sophistication, constructed from a substance so valuable that building a castle out of it was itself a statement of almost incomprehensible luxury. The relationship between sugar and medicine is worth pausing on. Medieval pharmacology used sugar extensively as a vehicle for delivering medicinal substances because sugar's sweetness could mask the bitterness of many herbal preparations. The apothecary and the confectioner were not entirely separate figures in the medieval world. The person who made sweet preparations was often the same person who made medicinal ones. Candy, in its original sense, derived from the Arabic kandi, meaning sugar, was a pharmaceutical product as much as a culinary one. The medieval sweet shop was in part a pharmacy. This blurring of the line between food and medicine, between the culinary and the therapeutic, is one of the most consistently interesting features of the medieval worldview. The modern separation between what you eat for pleasure and what you take for health would have been largely incomprehensible to a medieval person. Every food had properties. Every meal was a medical act. The cook and the physician were collaborators in the project of maintaining the body's balance. And the table was not just a social space, it was a therapeutic one. Let us turn now to medicine itself, because the medieval approach to healing the body deserves its own careful examination, not because it was simply wrong, though much of it was, but because the architecture of its wrongness is fascinating, and because the moments where it was right are genuinely surprising. The medieval physician was an educated person. Universities in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Padua, and elsewhere offered formal medical training by the 12th and 13th centuries. This training was heavily textual, based on the reading and interpretation of ancient authorities, primarily Galen and Hippocrates in Latin translation, and the great Arabic physicians Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes. The medieval physician was not a folk healer. He was a scholar, trained in Latin, versed in natural philosophy, and operating within a sophisticated theoretical framework. The problem was that the theoretical framework, however sophisticated, was built on foundations that were simply wrong. The humoral theory of disease had no connection to the actual mechanisms of illness. The medieval physician who treated fever by bleeding his patient was not being cruel or ignorant. He was applying a coherent theoretical principle that fever indicated an excess of hot, moist blood, and that removing some of that blood would restore humoral balance. The principle was wrong. The practice was often actively harmful, but the logic connecting principle to practice was internally consistent. Bloodletting was the most common medical intervention of the medieval period, applied to an extraordinary range of conditions: fever, infection, pain, mental disturbance, reproductive problems. Virtually any significant departure from normal health might be treated with bloodletting. The physician would open a vein, usually in the arm, and allow a measured quantity of blood to flow out, sometimes catching it in a bowl for examination. The amount removed, the location of the incision, the timing relative to astrological conditions, all of these were carefully considered according to the theoretical framework. Astrology was not a fringe belief in medieval medicine. It was a mainstream one. The planets were understood to govern different parts of the body and different humoral conditions. The physician who consulted the stars before performing a medical procedure was not being superstitious in the way we mean that word. He was being rigorous, applying all available knowledge to the problem of treatment. The knowledge happened to be wrong, but the commitment to applying systematic knowledge was genuine. There is something almost moving about this if you allow yourself to sit with it. Imagine a medieval physician on the night before the significant procedure, consulting their astrological tables by candlelight, calculating the position of Saturn in relation to the patient's birth sign, determining the optimal moment for intervention. They are not being careless, they are being as careful as they know how to be. They are bringing every resource available to them to bear on the problem of keeping another human being alive. The resources are inadequate, the framework is wrong, but the care is real, the intention is real. And in the dark of the night, by the light of a single candle, That physician and that patient are engaged in the same fundamental transaction that occurs in every hospital in the world today. One person, frightened and suffering. Another person, doing everything in their power to help. And yet, medieval medicine was not without its effective elements. The herbal pharmacopoeia that medieval physicians and healers, including the significant tradition of female healers and midwives who operated outside the formal university system, had accumulated over centuries, contained many plants with genuine medicinal properties. Willow bark, which contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, was used for pain and fever. Foxglove, which contains digitalis, was used for heart conditions. Garlic, which has documented antimicrobial properties, was used for infections. Honey, which is genuinely antibacterial, was used to dress wounds. The medieval healer did not know why these things worked. The explanatory framework they used to justify the use of these plants was entirely wrong. But the empirical observation that certain plants had certain effects on the body was real, and it had been accumulated over generations of careful, if theoretically misguided, practice. The medieval herbalist was, in a sense, sitting on top of a genuine pharmaceutical archive without having the conceptual tools to understand what it contained. This is perhaps the most poignant aspect of medieval medicine. The knowledge was there, embedded in practice, preserved in manuscripts, passed down through generations, but the theoretical lens through which it was viewed distorted it so completely that it could not be properly understood or systematically developed until the theoretical lens itself was replaced, which did not happen until the scientific revolution of the 17th century and beyond. In the meantime, patients were bled and purged and subjected to treatments that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful, while the genuine pharmaceutical knowledge embedded in herbal practice sat waiting for a framework that could recognize it. It waited in the dried bundles hanging from the rafters of the herbalist's cottage. It waited in the careful manuscript entries of the monastery garden. It waited in the hands of the midwife, who had learned from her mother, who had learned from hers. Patient as the plants themselves, ready to be understood when understanding finally arrived. Now let us talk about death, because the medieval relationship with death was, in many ways, the most alien aspect of that world to modernize, and also, perhaps, the most instructive. Medieval people died at rates and ages that are almost impossible for modern people in wealthy countries to fully comprehend. Infant mortality was staggering. A significant proportion of children born in the medieval period did not survive to adulthood. Childbirth was dangerous for mothers. Infections that would be trivially treated with modern antibiotics could and did kill otherwise healthy adults. The plague, when it came, could kill a third of the population of an entire continent within a few years. Famine was not a historical abstraction, but a lived reality that could descend on a community without warning and carry off the vulnerable in large numbers. In this context, the medieval attitude toward death was not morbid in the way we might assume. It was pragmatic. Death was present. It was familiar. It was a neighbor, a constant companion, something that everyone had encountered personally and repeatedly by the time they reached adulthood. The modern tendency to sequester death, to move it to hospitals and funeral homes, to remove it from daily life and domestic space, to treat it as something that happens elsewhere to other people. This was simply not available to medieval people. Death happened at home, in the same beds where people slept and loved and gave birth. The dying person was surrounded by family and community. The body was prepared for burial by the people who had known the person in life. This proximity to death produced cultural practices that seemed to modernize, deeply strange. The ars moriendi, the art of dying, was a genuine literary and spiritual genre in the medieval period. Texts were written and widely circulated that provided instruction in how to die well, how to face death with appropriate spiritual preparation, how to resist the temptations that the devil was believed to present at the moment of death, how to achieve the peaceful and faithful departure that would facilitate a good afterlife. Dying was a skill. It was something that could be done well or badly, and the community had a responsibility to help the dying person do it well. Consider what this means. In the medieval framework, the moment of death was not simply a biological event. It was a spiritual crisis, a threshold crossing that required preparation, support, and active assistance from the surrounding community. The priest who came to administer last rites was not performing a formality. He was providing essential equipment for the most important journey the dying person would ever take. The family members who gathered around the deathbed were not simply grieving. They were working, actively and purposefully, to help their loved one cross a threshold safely. Death was a communal project. It required everyone. The practice of keeping vigil with the dying and the dead was universal. You did not leave a dying person alone. You did not leave a dead body unattended. The period between death and burial was a social time, a time when the community gathered around the body, when prayers were said and stories were told and food and drink were shared in the presence of the corpse. The Irish wake, which persists in modified form to this day, is a survival of this broader medieval tradition. The dead were not immediately removed from the social world. They were held in it for a little while longer as the living adjusted to their absence. There was also the practice, documented across medieval Europe, of what historians sometimes call the second burial or the double burial. In some traditions, the body was buried initially, then exhumed after a period of time, the bones cleaned and examined, and then reburied in a different location or manner. This practice had complex theological and social dimensions. In some contexts, it was connected to beliefs about the relationship between the state of the corpse and the state of the soul. A body that had decomposed properly was taken as a sign of spiritual health. A body that had not decomposed or that showed unusual preservation could be interpreted as a sign of either sanctity or, more troublingly, vampirism. The medieval vampire, it is worth noting, was not the elegant aristocratic figure of Victorian Gothic fiction. The medieval revenant, the corpse that returned, was understood primarily as a public health threat. A community that believed a recently deceased member had become a revenant would exhume the body, examine it for signs of unusual preservation or bloating, and take measures to prevent its return. These measures might include staking, decapitation, or reburial with the body positioned face down. The logic was entirely consistent with medieval beliefs about the relationship between the body and the soul. It was wrong, in the sense that corpses do not actually rise and walk. But the cultural machinery that produced the belief was not arbitrary. It was a response to the genuine terror of epidemic disease, of communities watching their members die one after another, of the desperate need to find an explanation and a solution for suffering that was otherwise incomprehensible. The Black Death, in particular, generated an extraordinary cultural response that tells us a great deal about how medieval people processed mass death. The Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, was an artistic and literary motif that appeared across Europe in the aftermath of the plague. It depicted death as a skeleton or decomposing figure leading people of all social ranks, from pope to peasant, in a procession toward the grave. The message was democratic and equalizing. Death comes for everyone. No rank or wealth or piety exempts you. The pope dances with the peasant. The knight dances with the merchant. All are equal in the end. This was not a morbid obsession. It was a philosophical statement, a way of processing the incomprehensible reality of a disease that had killed indiscriminately, that had carried off the holy and the wicked alike, that had demonstrated with terrible clarity that the social hierarchies and spiritual distinctions that organized medieval life provided no protection against the fundamental biological vulnerability of the human body. The Dance of Death was grief transformed into art, terror transformed into theology, the unbearable made bearable by giving it a form that could be contemplated. And perhaps that is something we recognize even now, the human impulse to make art from catastrophe, to find a form for what cannot otherwise be held. Let us turn now to something that might seem lighter, but is, in its own way, equally revealing. Let us talk about medieval entertainment. The tournament is perhaps the most iconic form of medieval aristocratic entertainment, and it has been romanticized so thoroughly in popular culture that it is worth spending a moment with what it actually was. The early tournament, as it developed in the 11th and 12th centuries, was not the carefully choreographed jousting competition of later centuries. It was something considerably more chaotic and considerably more dangerous. Early tournaments were essentially organized melees, large-scale mock battles in which groups of knights fought each other across open countryside, with the objective of capturing opponents and ransoming them back to their families. These events were not bloodless. People died regularly. The church condemned tournaments repeatedly because they killed Christians in peacetime for sport, because they fostered pride and violence, and because the participants were often so focused on the tournament that they neglected their religious duties. Several church councils issued prohibitions against tournaments, and knights who died in tournaments were sometimes denied Christian burial. None of this stopped the tournaments. They were too popular, too economically significant, too central to the culture of the knightly class to be suppressed by ecclesiastical disapproval. The tournament was, among other things, a labour market. Knights who were good at it could make a living from ransoms and prizes. William Marshall, who rose from relatively modest origins to become one of the most powerful men in England and regent for the young Henry III, built his early fortune and reputation almost entirely on tournament success. He was, by the accounts of his contemporaries, extraordinarily skilled at the tournament circuit, capturing opponents and ransoming them with systematic efficiency. He was, in a very real sense, a professional athlete in a sport where the competition occasionally killed people. By the later medieval period, the tournament had become considerably more regulated, more theatrical, more concerned with spectacle and display than with genuine combat training. The joust, in which two armoured knights charged at each other on horseback with lances, became the central event. Elaborate rules governed the conduct of the participants. Blunted lances were introduced to reduce fatalities. The whole event became more of a performance than a battle. But even in its most theatrical form, the tournament retained a genuine element of physical danger. Horses fell, lances shattered, armour was not always adequate. People were injured and occasionally killed, even in the most carefully regulated competitions. The other great form of medieval public entertainment was the public execution. This is the aspect of medieval life that modern people find most disturbing, and understandably so. Public executions in medieval Europe were not hidden, not shameful, not conducted in private. They were public events, attended by crowds, sometimes by large portions of the town's population. They were scheduled in advance, announced publicly, conducted in prominent locations, often the market square or a hill visible from the town centre. The logic of the public execution was not simply cruelty, though cruelty was certainly present. It was, in the medieval understanding, a form of justice made visible. The punishment of the criminal was a public act because crime was understood as a public harm. The community that had been wronged was entitled to witness the restoration of order. The execution was a ritual reaffirmation of the social and moral framework that the criminal had violated. It was, in a terrible way, a form of theatre, with the condemned playing a role in a drama whose ending was predetermined and whose purpose was to demonstrate publicly and unmistakably the consequences of transgression. There was also a deeply theological dimension. Public execution was understood as an opportunity for the condemned to make a public confession and repentance before death. The crowd was not simply watching a punishment. They were witnessing, potentially, a redemption. The condemned person who died with appropriate spiritual preparation, who confessed their sins, who asked forgiveness of those they had wronged, who received the last rites. This person was understood to have a genuine chance of salvation. The execution was, in this framework, not purely punitive. It was also pastoral, a terrible pastoral, but a pastoral nonetheless. This does not make the practice less horrifying. The tortures that sometimes preceded execution, the drawing and quartering reserved for traitors in England, the various forms of burning and breaking that appeared across continental Europe, these were genuinely brutal in ways that no theoretical framework can fully redeem. But understanding the logic that governed them helps us see that the medieval people who attended these events were not simply savages enjoying cruelty. They were people operating within a moral and theological framework that assigned different meanings to public suffering than we would assign today. The question of what suffering means, what it is for, whether it has redemptive or punitive or social functions. This is not a question that medieval people answered wrongly and we have answered rightly. It is a question that every society answers differently, according to its own assumptions about justice, about the body, about the relationship between individual transgression and communal harm. Our answers are different from theirs. They are not obviously better in every respect. And sitting with that discomfort is perhaps one of the more useful things the medieval archive can offer us. Now let us move to something that touches the medieval world in a more intimate way. Let us talk about love and marriage, because the medieval understanding of these things was, in some respects, startlingly modern, and in others, almost incomprehensibly alien. The medieval church held marriage as a sacrament, one of the 7 sacred rites that mark the significant transitions of Christian life. Marriage was holy, it was permanent, it was the appropriate context for sexual expression and the raising of children, and it was, for most people in most circumstances, arranged by families rather than chosen by individuals. This is the aspect of medieval marriage that feels most foreign to modern sensibility. The idea that your spouse would be selected for you by your parents based on considerations of property, alliance, social status, and economic advantage, with your own feelings about the matter treated as largely secondary. This strikes modern people as a violation of something fundamental about human freedom and dignity. And yet, it was the norm across most of human history, in most cultures, including medieval Europe. What is interesting is the way medieval culture negotiated with this reality. Courtly love, the elaborate literary and social tradition that developed in the courts of southern France in the 12th century and spread across Europe, was in many ways a response to the gap between the arranged marriage as a social institution and the individual human desire for romantic feeling. Courtly love celebrated passionate attachment between a knight and a lady who was typically already married to someone else, usually someone of higher rank than the knight. The love was idealized, often unconsummated, expressed through poetry and song and elaborate rituals of service and devotion. This might seem like a recipe for social chaos, and it sometimes was, but the courtly love tradition also served a function. It provided a cultural space in which the emotional reality of romantic feeling could be acknowledged and celebrated, even while the social institution of arranged marriage remained intact. It said, in effect, that the heart has its own logic, that passionate attachment is real and valuable and worth celebrating, even when it cannot be the basis for the social contract of marriage. The troubadours who developed and spread this tradition were not advocating for adultery, or not primarily. They were developing a vocabulary for emotional experience that the social structure of their time did not otherwise provide. They were, in a sense, inventing the concept of romantic love as we understand it. The idea that love is an overwhelming, transformative, ennobling experience that happens to individuals regardless of social calculation, and that this experience has value in itself, independent of its social utility. This invention has had consequences that stretch all the way to the present moment. The modern expectation that marriage should be based on romantic love, that you should feel passionate attachment to your spouse, that the heart should have the primary vote in the selection of a life partner. This is not an ancient or universal human assumption. It is, in significant part, a medieval invention, developed in the courts of Provence and Champagne, and spread through literature and song across the European world. We are, in this respect, the heirs of the troubadours, living inside an idea of love that was crafted in the 12th century and has never entirely lost its hold on the imagination. And speaking of ideas that refuse to let go, I am curious what hidden chapter of history keeps you awake at night. What is the thing you cannot stop turning over? The mystery or the forgotten truth that the archive has not yet opened for you? Leave it in the comments. You might find someone else has been circling the same question in the dark. Let us spend a moment with the medieval church, because no examination of medieval life can avoid it. The church was not simply a religious institution in the medieval period. It was the organizing framework of reality itself. It provided the calendar that governed the rhythm of the year. It provided the rituals that marked the transitions of individual life. It provided the educational institutions, the hospitals, the social welfare systems. It provided the philosophical framework within which questions about nature, about humanity, about the cosmos were asked and answered. It was, in a very real sense, the operating system of medieval European civilization. This meant that the medieval experience of religion was not comparable to the modern experience of religion in wealthy Western countries, where religious practice is largely voluntary, largely private, and largely separable from the other domains of life. Medieval religion was not separable. It was not voluntary in any meaningful sense. It was the water in which medieval people swam, so pervasive and so fundamental that the idea of stepping outside it, of living a life not organized around its assumptions, was not a coherent option for most people most of the time. The liturgical calendar divided the year into a complex rhythm of feasts and fasts, celebrations and abstinences, sacred times and ordinary times. Advent before Christmas, Lent before Easter, the great feasts of saints scattered throughout the year. This calendar governed when you could eat meat, when you could have sex, when you should work, and when you should rest. It was not a supplement to daily life. It was the structure of daily life. The saints were not distant historical figures in medieval religion. They were active presences, intercessors, patrons, protectors. Every church was dedicated to a saint. Every trade had its patron saint. Every illness had its associated saint to whom you could pray for healing. The saints were a vast supernatural bureaucracy, each with their own area of expertise, each accessible through prayer and through pilgrimage to their shrines. If you had a toothache, you prayed to Saint Apollonia, who had been martyred by having her teeth extracted. If you were a traveller, you prayed to Saint Christopher. If you were a scholar, Saint Thomas Aquinas. If your cattle were sick, Saint Blaise. This was not superstition in the dismissive sense. It was a coherent theology of divine accessibility. The saints were understood as people who had achieved a direct relationship with God and who could therefore act as intermediaries, carrying the prayers of ordinary people to the divine presence. The system made perfect theological sense within its own framework, and it provided something that pure theology often struggles to provide, which is a sense that the divine is accessible, personal, and responsive to the specific details of ordinary human life. The pilgrimage was one of the great institutions of medieval religious life. People travelled enormous distances, on foot, in all weathers, often in considerable physical discomfort, to visit the shrines of saints and seek their intercession. Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome, Jerusalem. These were the great pilgrimage destinations, drawing travellers from across Europe. But there were also hundreds of smaller shrines, local saints, regional holy sites that drew pilgrims from the surrounding countryside. The pilgrimage was not purely a spiritual act. It was also a social one. The road brought together people from different classes, different regions, different backgrounds, and the shared experience of travel created a temporary community that transcended normal social divisions. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is, among other things, a portrait of this temporary community, the knight and the miller and the wife of Bath, all walking the same road, all telling their stories to each other, all momentarily equal in their shared purpose and shared discomfort. The pilgrimage was also, for many people, the most significant journey of their lives. In a world where most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, the pilgrimage offered an experience of the wider world, of different landscapes and languages and customs that was otherwise simply unavailable. The pilgrim who returned from Santiago or Jerusalem came back changed, not only spiritually, but experientially. They had seen things. They had met people. They had survived hardship. They were, in a very real sense, a different person than the one who had set out. Now, let us return to something we touched on earlier and go deeper. Let us talk about the medieval understanding of the natural world, because it is here, perhaps, that the gap between medieval and modern thinking is both widest and most instructive. Medieval natural philosophy, the discipline we might loosely call science, was not conducted through experiment in the modern sense. It was conducted primarily through the interpretation of texts. The great authorities, Aristotle above all, but also Pliny, Isidore of Seville, and others, were the primary sources of knowledge about the natural world. The task of the natural philosopher was not to go out and observe nature directly, but to read what the authorities had said about it, reconcile apparent contradictions between them, and integrate their teachings into a coherent whole. This approach produced some remarkable results. The medieval university, with its tradition of the disputatio, the formal debate in which opposing positions were argued and reconciled, developed the tools of logical analysis and systematic argumentation that would eventually be turned toward empirical observation and produce the scientific method. The medieval scholastic tradition was not the enemy of science. It was, in a very real sense, its parent. The rigorous logical analysis that characterized scholastic philosophy was the same rigorous logical analysis that later natural philosophers applied to experimental data. But in the medieval period, before the turn toward empirical observation, the natural world, as described in medieval texts, was populated with creatures and phenomena that modern biology does not recognize. The bestiary, a genre of medieval natural history text, described the animals of the world along with their symbolic and moral significance. The bestiary lion did not sleep with its eyes open because medieval people had observed this behavior. It slept with its eyes open because this was what Pliny had reported, and because the symbolic meaning of the behavior, the lion as Christ, always watchful, never fully absent even in apparent death, was theologically rich. The bestiary described the pelican as a bird that fed its young with blood from its own breast, piercing itself to nourish its children. This is not something that pelicans actually do, but the symbolic resonance with the Eucharist, with Christ's blood shed for humanity, was so powerful that the behavior became established as natural fact. The symbolic truth overwhelmed the observational one. The unicorn appeared in medieval natural history texts not as a mythological creature, but as a real animal. The rhinoceros, encountered by European travelers in descriptions from ancient sources, had been transformed through transmission and misunderstanding into the unicorn of medieval imagination. The monoceros, the one-horned beast, was real. It was just not what medieval people thought it was. The barnacle goose was believed to hatch from barnacles attached to driftwood rather than from eggs laid in nests. This belief had a practical theological consequence. If barnacle geese did not hatch from eggs, they were not technically birds in the conventional sense. And if they were not birds in the conventional sense, perhaps they could be eaten on fast days when meat was forbidden. The Archbishop of Canterbury ruled against this interpretation in 1215, but the belief persisted in some quarters for centuries. It is a perfect example of how medieval natural history, theology, and practical daily life were all tangled together in ways that seem, from the outside, almost impossibly complicated. The medieval cosmos was not the modern cosmos. It was not an infinite void populated by galaxies and black holes and the cold mathematics of physics. It was a nested series of spheres with the Earth at the center, surrounded by the spheres of the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and beyond them the sphere of the fixed stars. Beyond that, the Empyrean, the dwelling place of God the whole structure was not merely physical, it was moral. The earth was at the center, not because it was the most important thing, but because it was the heaviest, the most material, the most fallen. The divine was at the periphery, the outermost, the most spiritual, the most perfect. To move toward the divine was to move upward, outward, away from the material center. This cosmos was alive with meaning. The movements of the planets were not merely physical events. They were expressions of divine intention, influences on human affairs, communications from the cosmic order to the human world below. The astrologer who read the stars was not engaged in superstition. He was engaged in the interpretation of a language that the universe was speaking. The language was real. The interpretation was sometimes wrong, but the assumption that the cosmos was a meaningful, communicative, intentional structure, this was not an irrational assumption. It was the natural consequence of a worldview in which everything that existed had been created by an intelligent and purposeful divine being who had made it all for a reason. We have replaced this cosmos with a different one. Our cosmos is larger, stranger, more mathematically precise, and in many respects more wonderful than the medieval one. But it is, in one important respect, less habitable. The modern cosmos does not speak. It does not communicate. It does not care about human affairs. It is indifferent to human suffering and human joy in a way that the medieval cosmos was not. The medieval person who looked up at the night sky saw a structure that was, in some sense, looking back. That is a form of comfort that the modern cosmos does not offer, and it is worth acknowledging what was lost when it was taken away. Let us come now toward the end of our journey through the medieval archive. Though the archive itself is inexhaustible, and we have barely opened the first drawer, there is one more thing worth examining before we close the files for tonight, and it is perhaps the most quietly strange thing about medieval life. It is the medieval understanding of time. Modern people experience time as linear, progressive, moving from past through present toward future, with the future understood as potentially better than the past. Progress is the organizing myth of modernity. Things improve, knowledge accumulates. The future will be, or should be, better than the present, which was better than the past. This is so fundamental to the modern worldview that it is almost impossible to see it as a worldview at all. It feels like simply the way things are. Medieval people did not experience time this way. For the medieval person, the past was not a primitive antecedent to a better present. It was an authority. The older something was, the more reliable it was. The ancient texts were not outdated. They were foundational. Aristotle was not a historical curiosity. He was the philosopher, capital P, whose understanding of the natural world was presumed to be essentially correct. The church fathers who had lived in the early centuries of Christianity were not distant historical figures. They were the authoritative interpreters of divine truth, whose readings of Scripture were normative for all subsequent generations. This meant that innovation was, in the medieval framework, not automatically a good thing. New ideas were suspect precisely because they were new. The burden of proof lay with the new, not the old. If you wanted to introduce a new idea, you had to show that it was not actually new, that it was a recovery of something ancient and authoritative, a restoration of original truth rather than an invention of novel error. This is deeply counterintuitive to the modern mind, but it produced a culture that was, in certain respects, extraordinarily good at preservation. The medieval monastery was, among other things, a copying machine. Monks spent enormous amounts of time and effort copying manuscripts, preserving the texts of classical antiquity, maintaining the archive of human knowledge against the constant threat of fire and flood, and the simple physical decay of parchment and vellum. Without the medieval monasteries, an enormous proportion of what we know about the ancient world would simply not exist. The monks who copied Cicero and Virgil and the Greek tragedies, who maintained libraries in remote Irish monasteries while the rest of Europe was in various states of political chaos, these people were performing an act of cultural heroism whose full significance we have only gradually come to appreciate. Imagine the scriptorium in winter, a long room, cold despite the thick stone walls, lit by narrow windows and by the candles set beside each writing desk. The monks sit in silence, bent over their work, quill moving across vellum with a patience that is almost geological in its slowness. Each letter formed with care, each page a day's labour or more. The text being copied might be Virgil's Aeneid, or a commentary on Scripture, or a medical treatise from a physician dead 1,000 years. It does not matter. What matters is that the words survive. What matters is that the archive does not close. The monk who sits in that cold room, copying words he may or may not fully understand, is performing an act of faith in the future, a faith that someone, someday, will need these words, will be changed by them, will carry them forward into a song the monk cannot imagine. The medieval archive was a physical thing, rooms full of manuscripts, shelves of carefully copied texts, the accumulated knowledge of centuries preserved in the one medium that could survive the passage of time. The archive was sacred. The scribes who maintained it were, in a very real sense, priests of memory, custodians of the human inheritance, holding against the darkness the fragile light of everything that had been thought and said and understood before. And here, perhaps, is where the medieval world and this channel find their deepest point of contact. The Sleepless archive is, in its own way, a monastery, a place where the files are kept, where the things that history tried to hide are preserved and opened and examined in the quiet hours, when the noise of the day has settled and the mind is ready to receive them. The medieval monk who sat in candlelight copying a manuscript through the long winter night was doing something not entirely unlike what we do here, in the dark, together, opening the archive, reading the files, following the threads that lead back into the deep past where so much has been forgotten and so much waits to be recovered. The medieval world was not a simple world. It was not a dark world in the sense of being without light or intelligence or beauty. It was a world operating within a framework of assumptions so different from ours that encountering it produces a kind of productive vertigo, a sense that the ground of what we consider normal is less stable than we thought, that the things we take for granted as simply true are in fact the particular constructions of a particular moment in history, no more permanent and no more inevitable than the humoral theory of medicine or the barnacle goose or the communal sleeping arrangements that made perfect sense to everyone who used them. The medieval person who rinsed their mouth with urine was not doing something wrong by the standards available to them. The medieval physician who bled their patient was not being cruel. The medieval theologian who read the natural world as a text written by God was not being irrational. They were all doing what humans always do, applying the best available framework to the problem of living, making sense of a world that is always, in some fundamental way, more than any framework can fully contain. And perhaps that is the most useful thing the medieval archive can offer us tonight. Not a catalogue of historical oddities to marvel at from a safe distance, not a reassuring demonstration that we have progressed beyond the errors of the past, but a mirror, a slightly distorted, candle-lit, urine-scented mirror, in which we can see, if we look carefully, the same human impulses that drive us now. The desire to make sense of the body, the desire to belong to a community, the desire to understand the cosmos and our place in it, the desire to preserve what matters against the erosion of time, the desire, in the long dark night, for a voice that will tell us stories until we drift away. If sleep still eludes you, let this one run again. The layers have a way of revealing themselves differently on a second listen, in the quiet, with the lights low. And if someone you know carries a curiosity about the hidden machinery of history, share this with them. Every time these forgotten truths find a new listener, the archive extends its reach a little further into the dark, and the community of night archivists grows a little wider. The archive never closes. The files are always here, waiting in the dark, patient as clay, persistent as memory, ready to be opened again whenever you return. The candle burns low. The monastery is quiet. The manuscripts are safe on their shelves. Sleep well. The archive has another file open and waiting. The video on what if the Middle Ages created fake historical figures on purpose follows this one directly into the dark. It reaches into the question of how medieval chroniclers and institutions may have deliberately shaped the historical record, and what that means for everything we think we know about the past. The same candle-lit patience, a different, quietly unsettling question.